These are the secrets that Hollywood literally buried underground, and the toxic legacy that America's most beloved television studios have been sitting on for decades. When we think about the golden age of the 90s on television, we picture those familiar sets from our favorite shows. The coffee shop from Friends, Jerry's apartment from Seinfeld, those living rooms and kitchens where America's biggest sitcoms played out week after week. What we do not picture is what lies beneath those sound stages, and perhaps that is exactly what the studios were counting on. Hollywood's relationship with contaminated land stretches back further than television itself. It goes back to when studios were buying up cheap parcels of land across the San Fernando Valley, parcels that were inexpensive for a very specific reason. To understand how $100 million worth of television production ended up sitting on top of some of the most contaminated soil in Southern California, you need to understand how Los Angeles grew and what it buried along the way. In the early 20th century, the San Fernando Valley was a patchwork of agriculture, light industry, and open land. Chemical plants, munitions facilities, and industrial operations dotted the landscape. When these operations shut down, the land was sold without any serious environmental cleanup. No one tested the soil. No one checked the groundwater. The regulations we take for granted today simply did not exist. When the entertainment industry came looking for space to build studios, these former industrial sites offered exactly what they needed: large, flat, affordable parcels of land close to the heart of Los Angeles. CBS Studio Center, also known as Radford Studio Center, sits on a 55-acre triangular lot in Studio City. The site is bisected by the Los Angeles River itself, a waterway with its own long history of carrying industrial runoff through the valley. The lot houses 18 sound stages ranging from 7,000 to 25,000 square feet, 220,000 square feet of office space, and 223 dressing rooms. During the 90s, this was one of the busiest production facilities in the world. Seinfeld ran for 9 seasons on this lot, building an astonishing 1,380 individual sets over the course of the series. Think about that number for a moment. 1,380 sets, each one constructed and torn down, the materials hauled away or dumped. The show that took viewers on that delightfully neurotic tour of New York City never actually filmed in New York at all. It was all built right there in the valley, on that 55-acre lot next to the river. Seinfeld wasn't alone. Grace Under Fire, Third Rock from the Sun, Sybil and Caroline in the City were all filming at CBS Studio Center during the same era. The sheer volume of production was staggering, and so was the waste it generated. According to Earth Angel, an agency that helps productions reduce their carbon footprints, the average television show or movie in 2022 created about 240 tons of waste. That is with modern environmental awareness. In the 1990s, nobody was even pretending to care. Veteran Hollywood art director Karen Stewart described what happens at the end of a production in blunt terms. The dumpsters just line up at the end of the show, and there is no talking about it, because it is time to get off the soundstage. Now multiply that by dozens of shows running simultaneously across decades, and you start to understand the scale of the environmental impact. But the waste generated by productions was only half the equation. The other half was what was already in the ground when the cameras started rolling. The Environmental Protection Agency, spelled EPA, maintains Superfund site profiles for locations across the entertainment industry's footprint in Los Angeles. One of the most notable is the profile for the Universal Studios backlot fire site, cataloged under EPA identification CAN0009-08601. When a major fire tears through a studio backlot, it does not just destroy sets and props. It releases whatever chemicals are embedded in the construction materials, the paint, the treated wood, the synthetic fabrics. All of that seeps into the soil and groundwater. This pattern became the norm, building on compromised land and then adding layers of industrial contamination through decades of production. That is the real toxic legacy of Hollywood's studio system. The precedent for what happens when communities are built on contaminated land was established horrifically at Love Canal in Niagara Falls, New York. There, residents discovered their homes had been constructed directly on top of a chemical waste dump, containing 22,000 tons of dangerous materials buried 30 years earlier. The chemicals began seeping into backyards and basements. Newspapers and television chronicled the fear and anger as citizens learned what was beneath their feet. As one observer noted, that was the problem with the original Love Canal. They built on top of a toxic site they didn't know was there, and people got ill and people got sick. Love Canal became the catalyst for the Superfund program and fundamentally changed how America thinks about contaminated land. But it did not change everything. The entertainment industry, with its enormous economic clout and its ability to control its own narrative, continued operating on sites with complex environmental histories. The difference between Love Canal and a Hollywood studio lot is that nobody lives on a studio lot. The workers come and go. The exposure is intermittent. The studios have the resources and the legal teams to manage any questions that arise. The Corby toxic waste case in England proved that even airborne contamination from mismanaged toxic sites could cause devastating health effects. In a landmark 2009 ruling, a civil court established for the first time the connection between birth defects and the negligent management of toxic waste in the air. The case, sometimes called the British Erin Brockovich, demonstrated that you do not have to live directly on contaminated land to suffer its consequences. You just have to be close enough to breathe the air. That brings us back to the San Fernando Valley, where thousands of crew members, actors, writers, and production staff spent years working on lots with environmental histories that most of them knew nothing about. Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, where Friends filmed for 10 years starting on Stage 5 before moving to the larger Stage 24, was built on a 62-acre lot that First National Pictures established in 1926. Nearly a century of continuous industrial use on a single piece of land. Stage 24 was eventually renamed the Friends Stage after the series finale in 2004, a charming tribute that tells you everything about Hollywood's priorities. We name stages after hit shows. We don't name them after what's in the ground underneath. The 90s represented the peak of this arrangement. Hundreds of millions of dollars in television production, some of the most watched programs in American history, all created on studio lots with complex environmental legacies that nobody was particularly eager to discuss. The sets were temporary. The contamination was not. What makes this story so difficult to pin down is precisely what makes it so important. The entertainment industry is extraordinarily good at controlling information. Studios own their own land, manage their own environmental compliance, and employ armies of lawyers and public relations professionals. The records exist in EPA databases, in county environmental reports, in court filings. But they do not make for good television, and they certainly do not make for good publicity. So the next time you watch a rerun of Seinfeld or Friends and you are admiring the set design or laughing at the jokes, remember that those familiar spaces were built on ground with stories of its own. Stories that nobody in Hollywood was particularly interested in telling. The shows ended. The sets were torn down. The dumpsters lined up and hauled everything away. But the land remembers what we put into it, even when we would rather forget.